The first generation of container ships emerged in the mid-1950s as a response to the profound structural inefficiency of traditional maritime cargo transport. Following World War II, global industrial production and international trade expanded far more rapidly than port infrastructure and cargo handling technologies. General cargo vessels carried thousands of individual cargo units, crates, bags, barrels, steel coils, machinery, and equipment. Each unit required separate loading, securing, and unloading. Ships often remained idle in ports for weeks or even months. High costs, cargo damage, and theft were regarded as unavoidable elements of maritime logistics. Under these conditions, the concept of containerization began to take shape. It represented a fundamental shift in transport logic. Instead of moving individual cargo items, a standardized cargo unit would be transported independently of the mode of transport. The central figure in this transformation was the American entrepreneur Malcolm McLean. By the mid-1950s, he was one of the largest road haulage operators in the United States. He clearly understood that the greatest losses of time and money occurred not during transportation itself, but during cargo transfer operations in ports. In 1956, McLean sold his haulage company. Exploiting a legal loophole in United States regulatory law, he acquired the Pan-Atlantic Tanker Company. At that time, McLean had virtually no experience in maritime shipping. Nevertheless, he was forced to master the industry within a very short period. Pan-Atlantic was later renamed Sealand Shipping. The company would soon become the central driving force of the container revolution. One of Pan-Atlantic's first assets was the oil tanker SS Ideal X. The vessel had been built during World War II as a T2 type tanker. It had not been designed for container transport. Originally, it was employed exclusively for carrying petroleum products. Nevertheless, this ship was destined to play a decisive role in the emergence of a new era in maritime transport. Before her historic voyage, SS Ideal X underwent a dedicated conversion to enable the carriage of containers. The conversion was overseen by Malcolm McLean and his engineering team, with a key role played by engineer Keith Tantlinger. Tantlinger was responsible for the development of early container securing concepts and structural solutions that allowed truck trailers and container units to be safely carried on board a ship. As part of the conversion, SS Ideal X was modified to carry container units on her deck, creating the practical foundation for the first container voyage. On April 26, 1956, SS Ideal X departed from the Newark Elizabeth Marine Terminal in New Jersey. The vessel set course for the port of Houston. On board were 58 containers, each 35 feet in length. At that time, they were referred to as trailer vans. In addition, the ship carried approximately 15,000 tons of petroleum. The containers were carried on deck. They lacked standardized locking mechanisms. They also lacked any form of cellular stowage within the holds. The success of McLean's concept became evident almost immediately. McLean Industries began accepting orders for return cargo even before SS Ideal X arrived in Houston. Customers were offered a 25% discount compared to prevailing shipping rates. In addition to lower costs, the lockable containers significantly reduced cargo theft. Cargo theft had long been a major problem in conventional ports. The economic impact of containerization was radical. In the mid-1950s, loading and unloading conventional cargo cost approximately $5.86 per ton. The use of containers reduced this cost to 16 cents per ton. This represented a 36-fold reduction. Beyond financial savings, port turnaround times were dramatically reduced. What had previously taken weeks was now completed in hours. This single voyage is widely regarded as the beginning of the container era in global maritime transport. Following the success of SS Ideal X, a period of intensive experimentation began. In the early phase, containers were carried primarily on the decks of converted oil tankers. However, such solutions imposed serious limitations. These limitations affected capacity, stability, and cargo safety. They did not allow the creation of a scalable transport system. The real technological breakthrough occurred in 1957. At that time, Malcolm McLean initiated the conversion of C-2 general cargo ships. These vessels had originally been built for the United States Navy during World War II. On these ships, systematic below-deck container stowage was implemented for the first time. Fixed vertical steel guides were installed inside the holds. This created a true cellular stowage structure. This arrangement enabled precise container positioning. It increased transport safety. It significantly accelerated cargo handling operations. The first vessel of this series was Gateway City. The ship completed its maiden voyage as a container ship on October 4, 1957. Gateway City could carry 226 containers. Each container measured 35 feet in length. At that time, the TEU standard did not yet exist. Container ship capacity was measured in actual container units rather than standardized equivalents. Following Gateway City, additional vessels entered container service. These included Azalea City, Raphael Semmes, Bienville, and Beauregard. All of these ships underwent similar extensive conversions. They operated on regular routes. They often served ports lacking specialized container infrastructure. As a result, they relied heavily on their own shipboard cargo handling equipment. Together, these vessels formed the world's first consistently operating container fleet under the Sealand name. They demonstrated that container shipping was not merely experimental. It was a regular, predictable, and commercially viable mode of maritime transport. While Sealand established the first consistently operating container fleet in the Atlantic-oriented United States trades, containerization also developed along an independent track in the Pacific. Matson, focused on the United States West Coast and the Hawaiian Islands, adopted a different container standard in the early phase. Instead of 35-foot units, Matson built its operational system around 24-foot containers. Hawaiian Merchant represents the early Matson phase. This was the phase when container carriage was introduced and scaled in a trade environment that still combined containerized cargo with conventional cargo practices. The key technical point is that Matson's container length standard differed from Sealand's. This means that raw container counts are not directly comparable without stating container length. Hawaiian Citizen represents the transition toward a more fully developed container ship configuration within the Matson system. In historical descriptions of this phase, the vessel is commonly associated with a capacity expressed as 436 containers of 24 feet. In retroactive TEU terms, a 24-foot container corresponds to approximately 1.2 TEU. Accordingly, 436 24-foot containers correspond to roughly 520 TEU. This preserves the historically correct unit count and container length. Hawaiian Builder represents the continuation of this Pacific track in the mid-1960s. During this period, Matson's container operations matured into regularized liner practice in the Hawaii trade. The central technical and historical point remains consistent. Matson's early capacity reporting is anchored in the 24-foot container unit. TEU is a later comparative instrument rather than the original operational metric. Throughout the 1960s, container shipping gradually expanded beyond the United States and began to take shape as an international transport system. European shipping companies closely studied the experience of American operators, particularly Sealand, and increasingly recognized that containerization was becoming an unavoidable stage in the evolution of maritime transport. Unlike the early American vessels, Many European container ships of this period were designed from the outset specifically for container carriage rather than converted from existing cargo ships. Nevertheless, in terms of overall scale, hull dimensions, draft, and stowage concept, these vessels still clearly belong to the first generation. The culmination of this European phase was represented by container ships such as Ulster Express and Elba Express, built in 1968 for Hapag-Lloyd. These ships were introduced on regular transatlantic services between Europe and North America and played a key role in establishing reliable container liner operations across the Atlantic. Their design combined fully cellular stowage within the holds with multi-tier container stowage on deck, reflecting the transitional nature of the period. Operationally, these vessels entered service at a time when many ports were still adapting to container handling. As a result, shipboard cargo handling gear remained an important feature, allowing the ships to operate flexibly across ports with differing levels of infrastructure readiness. In this respect, Ulster Express and Elba Express embodied the technical and operational realities of the late first-generation era. From a capacity perspective, late first-generation European container ships are more frequently discussed in TEU terms than the earliest American conversions, because the industry was already moving towards standardized container metrics. In documentary narration, it is therefore appropriate to describe these ships as occupying the upper range of the first generation, typically in the band of roughly 700 to around 1,000 TEU. At the same time, it is essential to emphasize that these vessels stood at the threshold between two eras: the early conversion-based container ships and the fully standardized, larger, and more specialized second-generation container ships that would soon follow. The first generation of container ships represents a transitional but decisive phase in the history of maritime transport. These ships demonstrated that containerization was technically feasible, economically viable, and operationally scalable. Early experiments evolved into systematic solutions. Converted vessels gave way to purpose-built designs. Container length standards varied. Capacity metrics evolved. Only later did the industry converge on full standardization. The foundations laid during the first generation defined the trajectory of global container shipping. They shaped port infrastructure. They reshaped logistics chains. They established the container as the dominant unit of global trade. At the end of almost any discussion about SS Ideal X, a statement almost inevitably appears: it was not the first ship to carry containers by sea. And formally, this is true. Long before 1956, containers were already being transported by maritime shipping. In 1931, the vessel autocarrier entered service. It featured dedicated slot arrangements for automobiles and cargo units. In 1952, the vessel Alaska Cedar was built, which is sometimes described as the first ship with tightly packed modular cargo stowage. In 1955, 1 year before the voyage of Ideal X, the vessel Clifford J. Rogers transported more than 160 steel containers measuring 8 by 8 by 8 feet between Vancouver and the Yukon Territory. For these containers, the ship had specific internal arrangements and dedicated seating positions. And this is where the key question begins. If containers had already been carried before, why then is Ideal X considered the turning point? The answer lies not in the mere fact of carrying containers, but in the principle of the system. Earlier ships had either slots or specialized, individual solutions for a specific type of box, for a specific vessel without universality. They did not have a standardized container-to-container system, did not have a unified stacking mechanism, and were not integrated with port cranes and inland transport. This is where Keith Tantlinger enters the story. Working in tandem with Malcolm McLean, he developed the key elements that changed everything: corner castings, twist locks, and the logic of rigid, standardized connections between containers themselves and between containers and the ship. This was the moment when containers stopped being just boxes on a deck and became a universal intermodal unit capable of scaling across the entire world. So yes, SS Ideal X was not the first ship to carry containers by sea, but it was the first element of a system that transformed isolated experiments into a global container industry. And that is why history did not remember everyone who carried containers, but the one who turned them into a world standard.